on.
Hello, hello, my friends, and welcome to Sacred Democracy. I am Maddi Cheers, and I am very, very, very happy to be here with you. Hold it, technical difficulties. I'm always technically challenged, but really, really happy to bring this topic to you. It's so important. And today, our topic is the war on homeschooling and why it matters to you. So I have my wonderful friend, Carolina Allen, founder of Big Ocean Women, is here with us on screen. And I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce her other homeschooling mom friends that she's brought, and then we'll get back to the bulk of the show. So Carolina, over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having us on, Maddi. It's such a privilege and honor. In the course of my homeschooling years, I've gotten to know some outstanding women and work with them in the advocacy department. And I'm just blown away by how incredibly bright and capable they are. And so I am excited to introduce two of my good friends. So Kathy Mauluulu, who works with me at Big Ocean Women, and also Rhonda Hare, who works with another organization that we work closely together with, Gathering Families. And so these women are just phenomenal, incredibly bright and incredibly prepared and just dynamic leaders. And they're also homeschool mothers. So anyway, just Rhonda and Kathy, I'll give them a little bit of time just to introduce themselves and how many kids they have and how long they've been homeschooling. As of myself, I have 7 children, and I've been homeschooling from the beginning. Our oldest is not my birth child, but he's my stepson, and so he wasn't homeschooled. But the rest, the 6 and below, are all homeschooled. So I've been doing it for some time. My oldest biological is 17 years old, so we've been at it for quite a bit of time. So anyway, I'll pass it over to Kathy and Rhonda.
Hi, I'm Kathy Mauluulu, and I have 5 children, and I've been homeschooling for about, I think it's about 6 years now. And my children range in age from 2 to 18.
Wow.
So I'm Rhonda Hare. I have 8 children. I haven't homeschooled all of them. I started about 7 years ago. So Kathy and I are in the same general area. I started only about a year before she did. The oldest one that started homeschooling with me is graduating this year. So she's the one that I've had for 7 years, and I've got one that's graduated, and I've got all the way from a 3-year-old up to a 25-year-old.
Wow. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Yay for you guys. Wonderful. So, and that is part of the thing that interests me the most. And actually, I'm going to quote the author, Corey DeAngelis, who wrote the op-ed piece for the New York Post. At least go to war on homeschooling just when everyone's doing it. And that's kind of why we brought this topic up. So it talks about how we're all homeschoolers now. Schools have closed for more than 55 million students nationwide, and at least 34 states have shuttered schools for the rest of the academic year. Just in time, our media and academic elites are coming out swinging against homeschooling. And this goes back longer than people think, much longer. In her article, Kerry McDonald's article, the one that Carolina sent to me and posted on the internet. And Kerry McDonald is a senior education fellow at FEE, author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She wrote the response to Harvard's letter calling for a presumptive ban on homeschooling. It was an article written by one of Harvard's law professors. I'll pull her name in a second. But right now, I want to look at, Kerry McDonald gave 5 instances of where the article is wrong, but where it affects you at home who are not going to go back to homeschooling, or who maybe making a choice to start homeschooling because you're noticing that your kids are happier. You're noticing that kids who couldn't learn math at school in a 43-minute period are suddenly excelling at it at home when they've got 2 hours to work on it with somebody helping them figure it out and doing it in their own time. So things like that are going on all across the nation. So at this moment, when parents are reconsidering the power and impact they can have on the public education system as they see their children happier, as they see them having time to go outside and be in nature, as they see them working with curriculum that's on the internet, much of it homeschooling curriculum, much of it provided by organizations like these three women belong to and sponsor. And as they're having their kids do these interesting hands-on curriculum, they're asking themselves, why isn't public school like this? Why does my child want to go back to public school to see his friends or her friends, but is not all that concerned about going back to public school to have schooling? They're perfectly happy to be at home for that part of the day and do that, and then go back and be with mom and dad and the family and go back to school to see their friends. So that is the answer that we're hearing from students across the country. And the question that parents are asking now all over the country is, what is going on with public education? So the point that Kerry McDonald identifies, her number 4 point, and I'm going to let you experts talk to her other points, ensuring the proper role of government. That is a very interesting point. Last week, we talked about how in this homeschooling situation where parents and teachers who have to provide for the students are trying to figure out what to do, our friend Marianne Francisi, who is principal of Spark Elementary, which is a school for inspired education, who was on last week, talking about how special needs kids have not gotten their services delivered to them until New York schools were closed for 6 weeks. So her question was, and her quote was, we have to ask ourselves, what are the goals in education? Are they to serve children or are they to serve the government? And if you look at what this article on banning homeschooling is about, this point of hers is that apparently it's to serve the government. She would like the government to take over schools. So maybe you guys can speak to that a little bit. And then other things too.
Really quick, I'd just like to say that I think it's a very interesting time frame that they've kind of come out swinging against homeschool when everybody's doing it, right? And I think that for the people that it's working well at home, it definitely brings up the questions that you've asked. That, you know, they're like, what is going on with this overall school system? But there have been, I think, an equal number, possibly, of women, mothers, and parents whom it's not really working for them. They are overwhelmed because there are like a gazillion different online, you know, Zoom calls and all of these things. They're trying to recreate the public school, but at home. And so I have to as a homeschool mother, I have to kind of say that it's not quite homeschool that everyone's doing. I think it's just a crisis situation where everyone's trying to kind of now jump and do schooling at home. But homeschooling is very different in, you know, the ordinary circumstances where a family decides to homeschool their children with the children, and you get to know the kids and you know what subjects you're going to be wanting to study, and you research curricula, you spend months doing that, you get everything prepared. And so it's very much deliberate, and it's more of there's a lot of freedom in what you're studying and how you're doing it. And so this is definitely not the exact situation that a lot of homeschool families are used to. So for families that are struggling with this schooling situation at home, I think it can definitely be a time of vulnerability where like an academic institution that's so prestigious kind of comes out swinging to say, hey, it further takes away the parents' confidence to do that. So I feel like it's very interesting, the timing, and that they're even having this convention, the summit, and it's, you know, by invitation only. You know, it's very much directed against homeschooling.
Yep.
I think that there's something much larger at play here. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there before Kathy and Rhonda.
Kathy and Rhonda, do you want to make any comments?
I would just like to echo what Carolina said as far as with the current situation and everybody's children having to be schooled at home at the moment. They're public schooling at home, which is far and wide different from homeschooling for many of the reasons that Carolina mentioned. Homeschooling, you get to tailor your curriculum and your schedules to the needs of your children, individual children. You get to figure out what really inspires them to have a love of learning, and you get to cater to that. And it's not this fly by the seat of your pants, thrown together crisis mode that everybody else is trying to adjust to. I do think teachers, public school teachers throughout the country right now are doing everything that they can to try to make it as smooth as possible. But they're being thrown into a crisis situation too. And
they're often not given resources. We have a friend who's a public school teacher, and his district here in New York is giving him nothing.
Right. They're having to make it up as they go along, and they're not trained for this. They haven't studied for this particular scenario. Whereas homeschool moms that choose to do this, we have studied, we've researched, we've gone through so much curriculum in our preparation to try to figure out what works for our families specifically. And there's a lot of amazing things that we've been able to do that the public school system doesn't have the same freedom to do and isn't designed to do. And I think that's where a lot of the frustration and burnout and disappointment is coming from for a lot of families that are in this crisis situation right now.
Which I think makes it like interesting. Don't you think it's interesting how Harvard's not totally coming out swinging with all of this and the summit, and it's like taking the very foundation, like people that I think otherwise would be totally open to it, you know, are just in this vulnerable state, and they're essentially telling us that, you know, there's all these risks to homeschooling. It's extremely religious. It's for these extreme religious ideologues, that there's abuse that's happening. I mean, just essentially like expounding all of these false biases,
Yes.
And just spewing them everywhere. And because it's coming from this very respected source, you know, Harvard University, it's just very damaging. It's extremely damaging. And I think it's just the timing of all of it is very interesting.
Well, because they don't want the public questioning public education. I think when we look at what John Taylor Gatto, for those of you who are not familiar with him, was a New York City school teacher who won several awards, and then won the New York State Teacher of the Year award and turned it down. And when he retired, he wrote a scathing letter published on the op-ed page of the oh God, no, it just slipped right out of my mind. The Wall Street Journal. And what he said, what he's most often quoted as saying, is that he had to resign because he just couldn't hurt kids anymore. He went on to write his first book, Dumbing Us Down, which you can find on Amazon. And then the real pinnacle of his research over the years, which was published in 2017, The Underground History of American Education, an intimate investigation into the prison of modern schooling. Also available on Amazon if you're interested. Gatto argues that educational strategies promoted by government and industry leaders for over a century included the creation of a system that keeps real power in the hands of a very few people. What I'm trying to describe, he says, is what's happened to our schools was inherent in the original design for a planned economy and a planned society laid down so proudly at the end of the 19th century. Russ Kick, who offers in summary his review of the book, said, in other words, the captains of industry and government explicitly wanted an educational system that would maintain social order by teaching us just enough to get by, but not enough so that we could think for ourselves, question the socio-political order, or communicate articulately. Dude. And I have a whole timeline of how this has gone on through the years, but I kind of want to get your guys' take on this before I go on to that.
Well, I think connected with that, we had, so I'm in Utah. We had a case here in 1982 in the Utah Supreme Court that it had to do with the Children's Rights Act, which I thought was interesting because this Harvard law professor was talking about what are children's rights. And she's coming at it as, oh, the children have these rights and the parents have none, which is not true. But this is what the Supreme Court Justice said about that case. And this is why, what I think is at the heart of why this matters to people who aren't homeschoolers too. He said, family autonomy helps to assure the diversity characteristic of a free society. There is no surer way to preserve pluralism than to allow parents maximum latitude in rearing their own children. Much of the rich variety in American culture has been transmitted from generation to generation by determined parents who are acting against the best interest of their children as defined by official dogma. Conversely, there is no surer way to threaten pluralism than to terminate the rights of parents who contradict officially approved values imposed by reformers empowered to determine what is in the best interest of someone else's child.
Yes, wonderful. Good for them. Yay. And that is the problem. And I mean, if you look at the timeline of what's gone on in this country in the late 60s and early 70s, and probably throughout the 70s, after the hippie Vietnam War movement, when that becomes it becomes fashionable to be counterculture. We have all these experimental public schools springing up. We had public Montessori schools, public Waldorf schools. We had phasing schools where grades were eliminated. We had all this school choice going on in the public school system. And then the government goes, well, wait a minute. We're creating free thinkers out there. Hold it. Reagan comes in and he's like, no, our kids are failing these tests. They're doing very poorly out in the world. We've got to go back to reading, writing, and arithmetic. And then go fast forward with reading, writing, and arithmetic. Now we've got to have even more control once we get into No Child Left Behind under the Bush administration. But worst of all is the national core curriculum under the Obama administration. There has never been a more blatant, I believe, abuse of government power in relationship to public education, and definitely an attempted federal takeover of the entire public education system. And famously, President Obama's education Secretary of Education, when he was presented with all these protests from all over the country, his response was not to listen to parents. His response was not to go around the country and figure out why is everybody complaining about all of this. And there's plenty of complaints. I have quote after quote from teachers and principals and parents and government leaders about the problems with the national core curriculum. But his response was punishment. His response was, well, you don't do it, you're not getting any federal money. And then went to the states and said, well, especially here in New York, where we have this big opt-out of testing program, their response in New York was the same. If more than 50% of your kids opt out, you're not going to get state money, and we're going to threaten to take over your school. So now we're pitting neighbor against neighbor. And this is a process that in my lifetime, I have watched this go on at least 3 times. And that's just from my point of view.
Right. I think we're in the midst of a massive shift that's greater than anything we've ever seen. I think we went through a giant, industrial revolution in several sense, but we're moving into this new technological revolution that's beyond what we can even imagine. And it's integrally connected to the education system.
Yep.
So with all of these online assessments and everything, the new gold, we had a big gold rush, right? Back in the day. The new gold is data. Mm-hmm. And so they're gathering data through the educational system. And through all of these, enforced assessments, everything is based on assessment. All of these schools are held hostage, and the teachers. The curriculum is, not chosen by them. It's like you said, it's all core curriculum chosen by a handful of people.
Business people, no teachers, no administrators. It was all business people. And
exactly.
2 of the people on the original committee worked for Pearson Education, who are the people that published the tests and the textbooks.
Exactly.
No conflict of interest there, folks.
Total major conflict of interest. I mean, and so all of these students are just being seen as a commodity, essentially. And it's like they're not looked at as an individual unique with gifts and talents all their own. They're just kind of herded so that they can jump through whatever hoops, so that the school can get whatever funding, so that, and so it's very backwards to what true education, one would think true education to be. It's completely counter to all of that we know to be right and true, where you're cultivating an individual, where you're fostering a love of learning, and that it's completely backwards. And it's all for gain. It's all for the monetization of the gathering of data and kind of nudge people in certain directions. If anybody out there listening is really interested in looking at the heart of this, because you as you start asking these questions, you start peeling back layers of an onion. And there are a couple of people that are quite expert at this. Maddi, you should totally have them on your show.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Send me their names.
Allison McDowell and I'm forgetting people's names, but there's a lot of people that are quite expert in this. But Allison McDowell's blog comes to mind, and it's called Wrench in the Gears, and it's outstanding. And she's done significant research to really start looking at the heart of the issue and what's really going on. I'll give you a list of other women you need to bring on. For follow-up.
Very good. Wonderful. So, and how are you folks, you ladies out there dealing with this? My other guests.
It's been really nice. I think there's a false idea of what homeschooling is. Kind of Carolina was referring to this. We don't sit home with our children at all hours and lock them up. We're all over the place with children, taking them different places and learning different things and meeting with different groups. And so this has been a calmer time for us. It's been nice to just have everybody gathered around. We work on things at home. We work in the yard. We go around in the neighborhood a little bit, and that's about it. So it's felt like a time to pull in and heal from all the crazy, from all the divided attention, from pulling away from each other and pulling back in towards each other, gathering back home.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
I agree wholeheartedly. It has been a nice little reprieve to not have as many outside distractions and to really connect with each other on deeper levels than we even have before. Going back to something, Maddi, that you shared earlier about when the common standards or the Common Core standards came into play, you talked about we have this one size fits all system now.
Yes.
And I have a specific child that was in first grade when this all started rolling out. And he was in the public school system. And because homeschooling was not something that I ever set out to do. I never wanted to do it, had no interest in doing it, and never saw that as being something that I would do. But I just had this gut feeling that some of these reforms were not going to be good for my children. And as I saw things roll out, I noticed my first grader at the time, he was sick all the time. And I was constantly getting calls from the school that he threw up at school again today. And it was so bizarre to me because I'm like, he doesn't have a fever. Nobody else has been sick. Couldn't figure out what was going on. And this particular child has a lot of anxiety. And so we were already working through some of those issues. And it got to the point where he had missed, I think, 12 days of school because he kept throwing up at school. And one particular day, I got a phone call from the office, and the janitor even commented how worried he was about this child because the volume of vomit that he was having at school was so immense that they'd never seen anything like it. And we had taken him to the doctor, we had taken him to the emergency room. They couldn't figure out anything wrong. And finally, it dawned on me, every time he had to have a timed reading test, he would get really, really sick to his stomach and he would throw up. And it was to the point where he had lost like 5 pounds between the end of August and the 1st of December.
Oh my gosh.
For a 7-year-old little boy, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And I just had this really strong impression it was time to homeschool. And so I pulled him out at Christmas break, and he never threw up again. He never threw up again. And it took years to undo some of the, all he learned while he was there, and it wasn't because of his teacher. He had a great teacher. I love her dearly. But because of the system that they were being required to use, it was teaching him that he was stupid.
Yeah.
And that he wasn't capable of learning things simply because he learns in a different way. Exactly. And it's taken years to get to a point where he really can flourish and is really excelling. I have another son that was in the same type of situation where his teacher told him that he was a slow reader and therefore he wasn't a good reader. The kid has a photographic memory. He can read something once and he remembers all this detail from it. And I was like, why are we worried about just the speed and not the comprehension? Because what's the point of reading if we can't comprehend? And so for us, being able to pull out of that system really awakened my children in ways that I don't think they ever would have otherwise. And they're just really doing wonderful things.
And I think that is a really important point. And I know there are parents out there that since the advent of the National Core Curriculum have seen the same thing, the same exact thing. I was in Connecticut a few years ago, shortly after the rollout of all of this. And one of the teachers, we won't even get into the teacher dissatisfaction, the number of wonderful older teachers that have just resigned because they can no longer create curriculum. They have to follow this, pattern all the time, 6 weeks to learn this, 43-minute, a classroom on one topic, then we flip to another topic, then we flip to, your brain can't even do that. So we are setting kids up for failure. She was telling me that her brother is a dentist. And he said in the last 2 years, so the core curriculum rolls out about 2 years ago. In the last 2 years, he said pediatric dentist. So he would have kids come in. They would have, maybe 8% of his kids would grind their teeth. He said 90% of the kids he was seeing over the course of that 2 years were grinding their teeth at night. And then we heard over and over again, you can find articles on this out there, of doctors reporting stomach issues with children. We now have, I mean, in talking to Marianne last week, she brought up the whole thing of school phobia. There are so many kids in the state of New York that do not want to go to, that just flat out refuse. They're hysterical. They will not go. And I'm just speaking for my state. I'm assuming this is all over the country, but I could be wrong. But that the state has got to provide for them to go to schools like Marianne's, which works with, they're considered special needs kids. They give them a diagnosis. You have school phobia. When really what's going on is a lot of what you're describing, Kathy, that was going on with your son is going on with all kinds of kids.
Yeah.
All kinds of kids.
Well, it's easy to understand. I mean, nobody wants to be in an environment where you're just not seen as an individual, unique child with gifts and talents, because if your gifts and talents don't fit the mold, then you're bad. Or you just have to try harder and do more and stay in at recess and do this packet and jump through this hoop. And that's torture, especially for a child who's so creative and they want to be outdoors. They want to be exploring. Play is learning for children, for a significant part of their childhood, just to play and be outside and to create. That is their work.
And family and play is important to the community because that's where they learn their social skills. That's where they learn problem solving. That's where they learn to care and have empathy. Mm-hmm. All of that happens in the family and during play. And if you move that, what do? But you create people who are depressed, who spend $11 billion a year on antidepressants like we do in this country, that most of them don't need. You create these diagnoses, so we put our kids on drugs too, because we've reduced the scale of normal to here. I mean, years ago, I graduated high school in 71. I think that I skipped a year before I went to college. So when I was in my first year of college, I decided I would take abnormal psych because I thought it sounded interesting. I had to take it. You have to take some kind of science. And the scale of normal behavior for human beings then, if I drew the line, you can't even see on the screen, so you've got a little bit down here, abnormal behavior of people who are behaving this way, a little bit up here, abnormal sort of manic behavior way up here. And then this whole range of normal, huge range of what is considered normal, especially for children. And now what has happened is what's considered normal is about this big. It really, truly is. And then you've got all these other this is now we've got this diagnosis, this is abnormal. This is if this kid can't pay attention, if they're a genius, they're abnormal. If you're, because the public school has no way to deal with children who are different. These two, Marion Brady, a teacher, and Patrick Murray, an elected member of the school governing board in Bradford, Maine, wrote that Common Core drains initiative from teachers and enforces a one-size-fits-all curriculum that ignores cultural differences among classrooms and students. Nicholas Tampio, assistant professor of political science at Fordham University, said that the standards emphasize rote learning and uniformity over creativity and fail to recognize differences in learning styles, which is exactly what you ladies are talking about. Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what is left out of Harvard's criticism of homeschooling. There in this whole entire article, it's so unbalanced. There is no reference to any of this. And I find go ahead.
I was just going to say, thinking about that article, I've yet to meet a homeschool mom who is illiterate, even write themselves. I just thought that was laughable.
And I think, so when I first looked at the article, I thought I need to understand this woman more, Elizabeth Bartholet or Bartholet, whichever way she says it. So I did a little background on her, and I think I understand why she thinks this of all homeschoolers. She specializes in law that brings the worst cases in front of her. So to her, apparently that's the reality. But that is such a small fraction of homeschoolers.
Yes.
And I think that's important to look at. She's got the molehill right up in front of her face, so it looks like a mountain to her.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Well, even the way we talk about child abuse in this country, you would think that like 90% of kids are being abused by their parents, when again, it's horrible. I would, horrible, and we should definitely be working on solutions, but our solutions are also paper thin. I mean, it's a very small percentage of parents and children that are affected by that, but our solutions are remove the child.
Yeah.
And if you don't have social services, remove them, and then, so we remove them, and then some social services are underfunded and can't remove them. And some social services cannot work with parents or states to get the child placed in a better situation. So we haven't solved the problem. The problem could be solved through education and raising people that want to have families and that have empathy and that, that are feeling free and happy. When I always refer to the Great Law of Peace, and the grandparents during that time were the educators. And a child was with their parent, their mom, their aunties from about 1 to 3, from about 3 to 10. They were with grandma and grandpa, who they love and adore and know to raise them and to teach them. Part of the job of the grandparents wasn't to just teach the child the skills, but to watch the child, to look for those special gifts that child has, and then gear that child in the direction of those gifts. Because within any community, and if we're listening to the Jack Ma's and the Elon Musks of the world, we should be going back to that way of education. We need more art, more sport, more music, more creativity, less doing away with testing. With actually, Bill Gates finally just a few weeks ago admitted that all of this standardized testing is for naught, proves nothing, and we need to get rid of it, even though he was one of the biggest proponents behind Common Core and the standardized tests.
Yes.
Right.
You had the visitors you had on your show last week in the special education at Spark School.
Right.
One of the women was talking about the connections that the children have with their teachers, she was calling them providers. And she says, really, that's what's at the heart of good learning. It's the individualized relationships. Yep. And she was saying one of her big concerns was that with this time away from their teachers, the children are suffering because they've lost this valuable relationship. I look at this and go, okay, home is at the heart of everything. It's at the heart of multi-generation connection, value of yourself, connection to who you are and where you came from and what you can contribute. This all finds its most solid base in the family. Yes. And so as we're seeing right now, what a difference that makes to lose these connections with the teachers. Those teachers are wonderful, but they're not going to be with that child for all of their life. They're going to lose that connection at some point. But the family, this is a good time to step back and say, if my child is so affected by losing this relationship with the teacher, what does that mean about my value as a mother or my value as a dad or as a sibling? This is the time to take that as an indicator that we need to fix our relationships at home. And if you're overwhelmed, to moms out there who are overwhelmed with all these assignments, all the hoops that need to be jumped for their kids, it's okay to step away from the assignments and just focus on the relationships. Because when those are healed, learning will happen much more easily, and you'll be creating something that's invaluable for the rest of their lives.
Exactly. And the most important thing you can give to your child is self-confidence. And a child can't feel self-confident if they don't feel safe, if they don't feel loved, if they don't feel protected. And that all happens at home. Yes, it can happen from teachers. And Spark is a unique school too. I mean, you're talking about very small classrooms. Some of they go up to 5th grade, and I think they've got 5 or 6 kids in their 5th grade class. And so they are geared towards dealing with kids that can't deal with public school or that
Yes.
have special needs. So yet they do have these very personal relationships, but you're exactly right. Nothing that we can do can replace the relationship with family. Nothing.
The things that I was really impressed with, one of those ladies that was on, is she said her focus has been working with the parents through this. And she says the parents have been coming to her and saying, okay, we're overwhelmed. How can we handle this? We haven't studied this particular thing. What advice can you give us? And so it becomes a wonderful way for both to contribute.
Right. And that's where public schools should be heading.
Yes,
in my
I agree.
opinion. That yes, not everybody is going to want to homeschool or is going to be able to homeschool for one reason or another. But if public school can go back to having a relationship with the families who are sending their children to public school, with sitting down and listening to the parents' concerns. And I know some parents are going to be the not my child kind of parent, but if children, in my personal experience, if children are home and the parents have expectations of those children and their behavior within the family, their behavior on a sports team, their behavior at play with others, parents have those expectations. Those are the best kids we see in school all the time.
One of the big arguments that were made against homeschooling in general was that there's no accountability, that people could just get away with X, Y, and Z, and that there's nothing that could be done. And I think that, like, if I were to grant them that is the case, that let's say that there is some kind of a serious kind of abuse issue or something like that, with children in the home or something like that. I do still think that can be mitigated through a strong community base, because homeschool communities are very tight knit typically, and there's a lot of support for one another. And so I feel like the extended family and the community, they can all alleviate that, whatever stressors or burdens might be happening within the family if there is some kind of a situation like that. And I think that, like, the homeschool community is much more able to support families, therefore the children, rather than, I don't know, other situations where, tight-knit communities aren't so easily accessible. So I think that, things can be alleviated for families that might be struggling, and it should definitely, I believe that it can happen more readily through the family system, the extended family system, and then tight-knit community support that is very natural to the homeschool, community. I think that's the first thing that people do when they start, or the first advice that I always give and that I've heard many times is, as women are families are choosing to homeschool, get connected with a good homeschool community, and you find your tribe that way, and then women support each other. I mean, it is difficult. There are some days where you're like, you feel so overwhelmed, and just like being a parent and being a mother, it can sometimes be overwhelming. You have hard days, but when you do that, and you've surrounded yourself by a tribe of people that are there to cheer you on and to help. I can't tell you how many times, if I've had a hard time, I've called up a good friend and said, okay, this isn't working. I'm struggling with this child in this subject. Tell me some resources. What's another curriculum that we can try? And you create these really strong bonds, and you can lift one another instead of just scrapping the whole thing. Or, because if you think about abuse, it's some kind of dysfunction. There's somebody in the mix is hurting significantly. We don't just, give up hope on those people. We try to rally our forces to kind of lift and support and get people to a better place. And that's much more sustainable, I think, than slapping a label on them, looking at them as somebody that's defective, send them to directly right to meds. And then, we're kind of cutting people's connections to one another, and it's exacerbating the very problem that we're trying to mitigate in the first place. So I feel like if Bartholet's, arguments, and Harvard's arguments against homeschooling is accountability and abuse and all of these negative stereotypes that they're going to slap on us, I feel like just logically we can just reason that out. Like it's not the case. And the diversity that's happening in homeschooling today is just phenomenal. It's amazing.
It is.
So the fact that they're just painting everybody as these extreme Christian, fundamentalist, crazy people is super unfair.
Well, it's super
immature,
unfair and untrue, completely untrue. I personally know of a homeschooling community in New Mexico, and my friend John Stokes, who's the head of the tracking project, homeschooled his kids. He couldn't be more left, and wonderful. I adore him, and we don't always see eye to eye on everything, but we do on a lot of things. And he's an amazing, wonderful person. He homeschooled all his kids. He has friends. They're huge homeschooling liberal community in New Mexico, because they see the same thing that we see, is that this is like brainwashing that's going on here. And they don't want their kids brainwashed. If they're really liberal thinkers and free thinkers, they don't want their kids brainwashed. And he, because of his job, because of what he does, he was able to take his kids all over the world. I met his oldest daughter a couple of years ago. She's got her master's degree. She's an interpreter. She's an amazingly wonderful woman who was a dancer, who's just this incredibly well-rounded, thoughtful human being. And of course, you can be that if you're raised in a space where you're allowed to be a free thinker, where being you is being celebrated.
Right.
So, and that is very much what homeschooling provides. I like in Corey DeAngelis's article, where I actually don't know if Corey is a he or a she, where Corey says, the article that we're referring to, the Harvard article, also forgot to mention the 2004 report from the U.S. Department of Education estimating that 1 in 10 students in government schools will experience school employee sexual misconduct by the time they graduate from high school. By Bartholet's own logic, she should call for a presumptive ban on government schooling.
Right.
More fundamentally, Bartholet argues that the burden of proof should be on parents to get permission from the government to homeschool their own children. But this view is backward. Our children don't belong to the government. As the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1925, the child is not the mere creature of the state.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. Although lots of people don't know that, because part of the Common Core curriculum is we don't teach literature anymore. We do not teach the U.S. Constitution in high school any longer. All over New York, it's almost district by district. I talked to a young man who was apprenticing here at Strong Island Entertainment one time, and he did learn government. But then I talked to my friend who was raised in the Bronx, and he had no idea how U.S. government worked. None. So it's really sort of district by district, state by state, as to whether, and in the core curriculum, it's actually not there at all.
No, I think with this too, one of the things that we're really missing is a sense of history. Again, going back to your roots and knowing the story of who you are and how you got there and how the people around you got there. One of the things that was in that Harvard Law article was Elizabeth was saying that here's the quote. She says, from the beginning of compulsory education in this country, we have thought of the government as having some right to educate children so they become active, productive participants in the larger society. Well, I looked at that, and at first I thought, no, we haven't from the beginning thought that the government had a right. And then I looked closer at what she actually said. She said from the beginning of compulsory education. How many people in the country know that we've only had compulsory education nationwide for 100 years?
Right.
That means we had 300 years of non-compulsory education, during which time we've had literacy rates during that earlier non-compulsory time of 95, 98%. John Taylor Gatto said it was up to 98% in some of the colonies.
Right.
So right now our literacy rate's 79%. So if you're looking just at a little piece of something, it's easy to come up with any kind of conclusion you want to. But if you look back and if you know history and you look at the big picture, you see patterns instead and say, okay, this is what is the basis of things. This is how things really should be. What I'm seeing right now isn't normal. Mm-mm. And if you're looking at patterns now too, you talked about the educational reforms in the 60s and the free ideas and coming up with new ways to educate. The homeschool movement really only took off in the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And I look at that and say, it's the pendulum swinging the other way again. Yep. People were looking at this, and as it was growing more and more tightly controlled, people were saying, no, this is not a solid foundation for education. What does education even mean?
Right.
And what if my idea of education is different than the government's idea of education?
That's right. Exactly.
That's at the heart of a lot of it.
And that's why Marianne asked that question last week. What are we doing? What is our goal in education? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is our goal to support the government, or is our goal to support children? And we know more about the function of the human brain, the function of people in social situations than we have ever known before. And while we're jamming all this STEM, science, technology, engineering, math down the throats of our public school children, we are also not paying any attention to the latest research on the brain, to the latest research on education, to the latest research on societies and what supports good, healthy social function. We're just ignoring all of that because I do think that John Taylor Gatto is right, because there is this underlying movement. I mean, I've taught in cultural arts programs. I teach all over the Northeast, and I go into some of these elite private schools. And the very first time I did this, maybe 22 years ago, I go into what John Taylor Gatto describes as the 11 elite private schools that all other private schools are based on. I happen to teach at one of them. I go there every year. The first time I went there was 22 years ago. And my first thought was, why is everybody talking about curriculum in public? They have curriculum. Why aren't they teaching this stuff? Why aren't we doing this stuff in public school? Why? And I was a Montessori teacher a long time ago for preschool. And I always thought with Montessori, why isn't there more of this? Why, so it's not like the answers aren't out there. The people that go to these elite private schools don't want us to know the answers. I thought it was very interesting that that Gatto identified, we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to point out from talking to all you homeschoolers that you do teach the things that are taught in these elite private schools. And what he was surprised to find out was that they're not, in order to, and I'm just going to mention a few, in order to graduate, it's not even a matter of grades. What they have to know is things like, no kid graduates without knowing theories of human nature. What buttons can be pressed to get the results you want? To do this, they study history, philosophy, theology, which is totally not studied in public school, and literature and law. This is their database. All of that, I'm sure you all do in homeschooling. I know from just listening to you and talking to you as your kids get older, but also none of that is in the core curriculum. And there were lots of articles written when it first came out, even by liberal people, about what happened to literature, because there is none. And the excuse that was given back then when that first came out, when they talked to one of the business people who set it up, said, well, these kids are going to have to know how to write monthly reports. So how's literature going to help with that? And that, I thought, single most revealing statement ever made about where the government wants our schooling to be. So, ladies, we have like 5 more minutes. I'd like to give you each a chance to say something important or wrap it up. And hopefully I'll have you back. I would love to have you back when we do our show on changing education.
Yeah, I'll just take a little minute. I think that we're in this really critical time in the history of humankind, to tell you the truth.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a lot that we are capable of doing and that we must do, and that we need to really go back to our intuitive gut. And if you are a mom out there listening to this, if you're a dad out there listening to this, just carve your own path based on your instinct and your intuition right now. Don't feel like you have to be, a hamster in the wheel, just spinning. We have an opportunity to, this great pause that we've had, or that we're still in the middle of, it can give us a rebirth, and we can carve out our own futures and that of our children, and not to be afraid of what that might be. And surround yourself with people that are also brave too, and doing that. And I think something really beautiful is in store for all of us as we do that. So
I believe that too. And I believe too that it is going to ultimately bring us back to spirituality. I was very sad when I read this statistic about a lot of young people who, the highest rate of young people we've ever had in this country, 30% at this moment, who don't believe in any form of spirituality, much less go through a religion. And as we know, the religious community is extremely important in having a sense of safety, whether or not you subscribe to a specific religion. But there's also reams of research on people that have some sort of spiritual belief are happier, are healthier, and that those moral guidelines that so many religions and spiritualities give to us are very, very important. And those things, those old ways, I think, need to come back. Many of those old ways. Anybody else before we sign ourselves off? Well, I want to thank you all. You've been wonderful. I hope you come back on. I would like to continue our discussion as maybe in a couple of months and see where we all are and see what happens with this Harvard closed door invitation only meeting on homeschool. Let's find out. Anytime there's a closed door meeting, that's the time you go, yeah, that's the red flag right there. Sorry, closed door. And that's not democracy. For those of you who believe as I do that democracy is sacred and a gift from the Creator. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much. I will have these wonderful women back on at another time. And as always, I wish you all peace, love, and unity. Thank you. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, everybody at Strong Island Entertainment.
thank you.
Thank you.
Next week.
Thank you.
Wonderful.